Nothing about that day felt dangerous. The street was too quiet, too ordinary. The kind of place where nothing ever makes the news. Cars sat motionless along the curb. Windows were closed. And behind one unremarkable door, everything had already ended. There were no screams, no broken glass, no frantic call for help. Only a heavy silence that didn't belong to a normal afternoon. Because by the time police were called, there was no emergency left to stop and no life left to save. The truth had already settled inside that house, waiting, and when officers finally opened the door, they didn't interrupt a crime in progress. They stepped into the aftermath of a decision that had been made long before anyone thought to look. And in that moment, it became clear that this was never a story about what the police found, but about how everything was already over before they arrived. A perfect morning, hidden shadows. The morning looked flawless, sunlight spilling gently across the street, birds breaking the silence, routines unfolding exactly as they always had. But inside the house, something was already wrong. Something cold and irreversible lingering in the air, hidden beneath calm walls and locked doors. Because while the world outside believed it was just another peaceful day, a decision had already been made, a line already crossed, and the quiet no longer meant safety. It meant concealment. It meant that the danger had passed not because it was avoided, but because it had finished its work. And long before anyone sensed fear, long before help was even considered, the ending was already waiting in the dark. Small signals, big questions. Small signals were everywhere, barely noticeable, easy to dismiss, a missed call, a door that stayed closed too long, a routine that felt slightly off, the kind of details no one panics over until it's too late, because nothing here screamed danger, it whispered it, and those whispers raised questions that arrived quietly but refused to leave. Questions about timing, about silence, about why no one realized that these subtle breaks in normal life were warning signs, because in the Daniel Green case, the truth didn't announce itself with violence or chaos. It revealed itself through absence, through hesitation, through moments that seemed insignificant until they became impossible to ignore. And once those questions began to surface, there was no turning back, only the slow realization that something terrible had already happened. Whispers no one heard. The whispers were there, faint and easily ignored, tucked between normal conversations and ordinary moments. A silence that lingered too long, a presence that suddenly felt absent, signs so subtle they blended into routine, because nothing demanded attention, nothing sounded an alarm, and that was the danger. These were not warnings meant to be heard, they were warnings meant to be overlooked. And by the time the questions finally surfaced, the whispers had already done their damage, leaving behind only stillness, unanswered doubts, and the chilling realization that the truth had been trying to speak long before anyone was ready to listen. Behind closed doors, danger doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it settles in quietly, rearranging the furniture of a life one emotion at a time, turning love into leverage and concern into control. And for Daniel Green, that transformation happened slowly enough to feel survivable, manageable, almost normal. Because what began as intensity looked like passion. What felt like jealousy masqueraded as devotion, and every warning sign came wrapped in an apology convincing enough to reset the clock again and again. But the walls of that house were learning a different story, one written in sudden rages, slashed furniture, and silences that lingered too long. A private world where anger didn't just flare, it destroyed. Where unpredictability became routine, and where Daniel, trained to read threats on the street, kept mislabeling the danger at home as something he could absorb, something he could outlast, something he could fix if he just endured a little longer. Because that's what protectors do. They stand still so others don't have to. Yet behind those doors, the balance of power was shifting. Control tightening its grip through isolation, emotional volatility, and fear disguised as concern. until the line between peacekeeping and self-erasure disappeared, and moments that should have ended everything instead became footnotes. A motorcycle sabotaged and nearly turned into a roadside death. A loaded gun raised over a sleeping man's head and lowered only after the message was delivered. Threats that didn't echo outward but sank inward, teaching him to stay quiet, to minimize, to survive. And every time Daniel chose silence over exposure, the walls grew thicker, the danger more patient, because obsession doesn't need chaos to grow. It thrives in secrecy, in familiarity, in the belief that love excuses everything. And by the time the outside world saw cracks forming, Cherie, inside those closed doors, the outcome was already rehearsed, planned in whispers and waiting, turning a home into a trap, intimacy into access, and safety into illusion, proving that the most terrifying violence doesn't always burst in from outside. Sometimes it lives with you, learns your routines, and waits for the moment when you finally let your guard down. A glimpse of unease. At first, it was nothing anyone could point to, just a feeling that surfaced and disappeared as quickly as it came. A pause that lingered a second too long. A reaction that felt heavier than the moment deserved. Small fractures in an otherwise ordinary life that were easy to excuse and easier to forget, because nothing had exploded yet and no rule had been broken. But unease has a way of announcing itself quietly, slipping through tone and timing rather than words. And for Daniel, those early moments arrived disguised as concern, as intensity, as a kind of attention that felt flattering until it didn't, until the air in the room changed without warning and calm could turn brittle in an instant, teaching him to watch moods instead of clocks, to anticipate reactions instead of living freely. And though each incident on its own seemed survivable, even forgettable, together they formed a pattern that refused to stay invisible, a growing sense that something was off, something tightening, something waiting, because the most dangerous situations rarely begin with fear. They begin with discomfort, the kind you explain away, the kind that asks for nothing except your silence, right up until that silence becomes the thing that keeps you trapped. Here are the first warning signs. The first warning signs didn't arrive like alarms. They crept in quietly, hidden inside moments that were easy to excuse and even easier to rationalize. Sudden bursts of anger that felt out of proportion. Apologies that followed too quickly. Moods that shifted without warning. Teaching Daniel to measure his words and read the room before speaking. Because nothing here looked like danger yet. It looked like stress, like passion, like a relationship finding its balance. But beneath that surface, the signs were stacking up. Furniture destroyed in fits of rage, arguments spilling into public spaces, a tension that never fully dissolved, even on good days. And each time Daniel chose patience over confrontation, endurance over exposure, the line moved. What once would have ended everything became something to survive instead, until warning signs stopped feeling like warnings at all and started feeling like the cost of keeping the peace. And by the time those signals could no longer be ignored, they were no longer signs of what might happen. They were previews of what was already coming. When tension builds, it doesn't always shout. It tightens, slowly and deliberately, turning everyday life into something that feels measured and watchful, where silence becomes loaded and even small moments carry weight. And for Daniel, the pressure didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated day after day, argument after argument, until the air inside his home felt different, heavier, as if it was holding its breath. Because reactions no longer matched situations and anger could erupt without warning, leaving him bracing for the next shift instead of resting in the present. And this is how tension reshapes a person. It teaches you to anticipate rather than live, to calculate rather than relax, to stay alert even in your own home. And as that tension grew, control began to replace compromise. Independence started to feel like a threat, friendships like competition, freedom like betrayal. And the more Daniel tried to keep things calm, the more unstable the ground became beneath him, because tension fed on restraint, on silence, on the belief that holding everything together was safer than admitting it was already falling apart, until the pressure reached a point where something had to give. And what makes this moment so terrifying is not knowing when that release will come, only knowing that when it does, it will not be gentle. The day everything changed. The day everything changed did not announce itself with chaos or urgency. It began like any other, ordinary and unremarkable. A day built from routines so familiar they felt safe. And that is what made it deadly, because while Daniel moved through his morning believing he was in control of his world, someone else was already rewriting the ending, unseen and deliberate, turning his own home into a waiting place, a space where time slowed and intention sharpened. And when the moment finally arrived, it didn't feel like an explosion. It felt like a collapse, sudden and absolute. The point where tension that had been building for years no longer needed words, no longer needed threats, because it had found purpose. And in that instant, every ignored warning, every minimized fear, every decision to endure instead of escape converged into a single irreversible outcome, proving that the most devastating days don't always look different from the ones before them. They only reveal themselves afterward, when the silence settles, the routine breaks, and it becomes painfully clear that everything familiar ended before anyone realized it was happening. Calls unanswered. Silence grows. At first, it was just missed calls, the kind that happen when someone is busy or distracted, but as the hours passed and the phone stayed silent, concern began to creep in, because Daniel was not someone who disappeared without explanation. He answered messages, he showed up, he followed routines with almost ritual consistency, and when that pattern broke, the absence felt louder than any alarm, each unanswered call stretching the silence further, turning ordinary worry into something heavier, something unsettled, because silence has weight when it replaces a voice that should be there. And as time moved forward without a response, the truth edged closer, uninvited and unwelcome, until it became clear that this wasn't delay or inconvenience, it was finality. The kind that grows in the spaces between ringing phones and locked doors, where the worst possibilities slowly stop feeling impossible and start feeling inevitable. Police, at the threshold. The moment police arrived, the story had already slipped beyond saving, because standing at that doorway was not the beginning of an investigation, but the edge of an ending, the kind that announces itself through instinct before evidence, through a feeling officers learn to trust but never want to confirm. The house was too quiet, not the peaceful quiet of an empty home, but a dense, unnatural stillness that pressed inward, as if the walls themselves were holding something back. And when the key turned and the door opened, there was no rush of movement, no sound, no resistance, only the heavy realization that whatever they were there to stop had already finished. Rooms sat untouched, ordinary, almost polite. A couch, a hallway, familiar objects frozen in place. Yet every step forward felt wrong, because silence at a scene like this is never neutral. It is loaded. It means time has passed, choices have been made, and consequences are waiting. And as officers moved deeper into the house, that certainty sharpened, the kind that tightens the chest before the mind can fully process it, until they reached the bathroom, a space meant for privacy and routine, now transformed into the final point of truth, where Officer Daniel Green lay on the floor, unarmed, vulnerable, alone, the protector reduced to a victim inside the one place he should have been safest. And in that instant, the threshold behind them ceased to matter, because crossing it hadn't changed the outcome. It had only revealed it, confirming that this was never a case of arriving too late by minutes, but too late by years. Years of ignored signs, normalized danger, and silence mistaken for peace. And as the house filled with procedure and radio calls and measured steps, he knew one truth remained immovable. When police stood at that threshold, there was nothing left to interrupt, only the weight of a tragedy that had already decided its ending long before anyone knocked. Secrets revealed in the dark. In the darkness, secrets lose their patience. They begin to surface not all at once, but piece by piece, as investigators move carefully through rooms that look ordinary yet feel charged, every shadow holding context, every object quietly testifying to what happened when no one was watching. Because darkness doesn't just hide truth, it preserves it. And here it had preserved intentions, movements, and decisions that were never meant to be seen. Entry points that told a story of access and planning, spaces that revealed waiting rather than panic, and evidence that spoke not of chaos, but of control, and the kind of control that requires time, certainty, and belief that the outcome is justified. And as details emerged, the silence of the house began to make sense. This wasn't a crime born in a moment. It was a conclusion reached slowly and carried out deliberately. The dark, revealing what daylight had missed for years. That obsession had replaced love, that patience had turned predatory, and that the most dangerous acts are often the quietest ones, executed without witnesses, without haste, in places where trust once lived. And by the time the truth was fully illuminated, it no longer shocked. It confirmed what the darkness had known all along, that this ending had been waiting, rehearsed, and hidden in plain sight until the moment it no longer needed to stay hidden. The truth emerges. The truth did not arrive all at once. It surfaced slowly, reluctantly, as if even it understood the weight of what it revealed, because with each new detail the silence began to speak. Timelines aligned, movements were traced, and what once looked like confusion sharpened into intent, the kind that leaves no room for coincidence. Surveillance footage placing presence where denial had lived, recovered evidence turning suspicion into certainty, and a story collapsing under the pressure of facts that refused to stay buried. Because truth has a way of tightening the circle, closing off exits until only one path remains. And as investigators followed that path, it became clear this was not a crime of impulse or panic, but of preparation and resolve. A sequence of choices made long before the final moment. And when the full picture finally came into focus, it carried a chilling clarity. This was not about a single day or a single act. It was about years of control, fixation, and ignored warnings converging into one irreversible outcome. And in that moment, the case stopped being a mystery and became something far heavier, an understanding that the ending had never been in question, only how long it would take for the truth to be forced into the light. Too late to stop it. By the time anyone realized what was happening, there was nothing left to interrupt, no moment to rewind, no decision still waiting to be made, because the outcome had already settled into place, shaped by years of ignored warnings and normalized fear. And when the final steps were taken, they unfolded without urgency or chaos, only certainty. Sneer's the kind that comes when someone believes the ending is justified, and this is what makes it so devastating. Not that help failed to arrive, but that help was never given the chance to matter, because every opportunity to stop it had passed quietly, one minimized sign at a time, one moment of endurance replacing action until intervention became impossible. And what remained was not a question of how it could have been prevented, but the unbearable realization that prevention had been available for years, just never taken, leaving behind a silence that no response, no siren, and no verdict could ever truly undo. Consequences unfold. The consequences did not arrive in a single wave. They unfolded slowly, relentlessly, touching every life connected to that house, spreading outward from the moment everything stopped. Because death is not an ending, it is a rupture, and what followed was a chain reaction of loss that could not be contained. A child growing up without a father and without a mother, a family forced to carry grief alongside unanswered questions, colleagues replaying conversations looking for signs they missed, and a community struggling to reconcile how something so violent could grow undetected in such ordinary surroundings. And as the legal process moved forward, with its careful language and measured timelines, the emotional fallout ignored schedules. It lingered in empty rooms, in birthdays marked by absence, in the permanent knowledge that one decision had erased futures that would never be rewritten. And this is where the true weight of the crime settles, not in the moment it was committed, but in the years that follow. teach you where consequences live on quietly, shaping lives, redefining identities, and proving that when violence finally breaks the silence, it never stops at the door where it began. The final silence, right? In the end, what remains is silence, not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that settles after everything has been taken. A silence that fills rooms once occupied by routine, laughter, and expectation, and now holds only absence, because the voices that mattered most will never answer again. One silenced forever, the other locked away behind years and consequences that cannot undo what was done. And this silence stretches far beyond the house where it began. It follows a child, growing up with memories shaped by stories instead of moments. A family learning to live with grief that never fully loosens its grip, and a truth that no verdict can soften, that control mistaken for love can hollow out a life long before it ends. And as the case closes and the world moves forward, this silence remains, heavy and unresolved, a reminder that some endings do not arrive with noise or final words. They arrive quietly, after the damage is complete, when there is nothing left to say and nothing left to save, when silence speaks louder than screams. In the end, this case does not echo with gunshots or courtroom words. It lingers in silence, the kind that follows after everything irreversible has already happened. Because Daniel Green did not die in chaos. He died in quiet, inside a home that should have meant safety, after years of tension that never screamed loudly enough to force intervention. And that is what makes this story so unsettling. The danger was not hidden in darkness or strangers. It lived in familiarity and routine, in love that slowly transformed into control. And when the final moment arrived, there was no warning left to give, no scream left to hear, only the absence that followed. A child growing up without parents, a family carrying grief instead of answers, and a truth that speaks long after the case is closed. That silence is not peace, endurance is not strength, and when warning signs are whispered instead of shouted, they can still be deadly, because sometimes the most terrifying stories are not the ones filled with noise, but the ones that end so quietly, they leave the world realizing too late that the screams had been there all along, just never heard. If this story made you think, share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. And if you want more true crime documentaries focused on warning signs and human behavior, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next case. Like the video if it helped you see things differently. And remember, sometimes listening is how silence gets broken.